At 19, Odessa had aged out of foster care with a duffel bag, a library card, and $31 to her name, and she had long since stopped believing anyone had ever wanted her. Then a letter found her. A grandfather she had never met, dead 4 months, had left her everything he owned. Everything turned out to be an abandoned flour mill on a dead creek, buried under more back taxes than the ruin was worth. The lawyer told her not to bother. She took the bus north anyway because it was the only proof she had ever come from anywhere. She turned the key in a mill that had not ground a single grain in years, and what that old man had spent the last of his life leaving inside for her, no one saw coming. The place they had put her was called a transitional residence, which was a polite way of saying the last stop before the sidewalk. It was 1 bed in a room of 4, a locker with a lock she had to buy herself, and a rule that you were out the door by 7 in the morning, whether you had anywhere to be or not. Most mornings, Odessa did not. She had bussed tables at a pancake house near the bus depot until they cut her to 1 shift a week, then to none. And after that, she filled her days keeping warm in the public library and stretching a coffee across 3 hours so the manager at the diner across the street would not run her off. Being invisible was something she was good at. She had learned it young. You kept your bag small and your eyes down, and you did not ask anyone for anything, because asking was how people learned you had nothing. And once they knew that, they treated you like it was catching. The letter came to the residence on a Tuesday. The woman at the front desk slid it across the counter like it might be a summons. It had Odessa's full name typed on the front, Odessa Klein, and a return address from a law office 200 miles north in a county she had never heard of. For a second she was afraid to open it. Mail, in her experience, was never good news. It was a bill or a form or a notice that some door was closing. She opened it standing up. A grandfather. The word did not fit in her mouth. She read the paragraph 4 times before it started to mean anything. Emmett Rourke of the town of Renfrew, deceased in the spring, had named her the sole heir of his estate. Would she please contact the office at her earliest convenience? Odessa had spent her whole life certain of one fact about herself, which was that she came from nobody. She had been 3 years old when her mother died. There had been no relatives to call, no name to trace, nothing in her file but a mother who had gone by Klein and left the world without leaving a single thread to follow. Odessa had made her peace with that the only way a person can, which was to decide she did not need anyone anyway. Now here was a name. Emmett Rourke, and the word grandfather sitting there in typed black ink like it had always belonged to her. She used the library phone to call the number. A tired man answered, a lawyer who handled small estates and sounded like he handled too many of them. Miss Klein, he said, I'll be honest with you, because I think honesty saves everybody time. What your grandfather left you is a liability more than a legacy. What is it? She said. It's a mill, an old flour mill on Kettle Creek, out past town. Water-powered, hasn't run commercially in decades. The building's standing, more or less, but there's $9,000 and change in back taxes owed on the parcel, and the county's got it slated for a tax sale this fall. If nobody pays what's owed, it goes to auction and you walk away with nothing but the trip. How much is it worth? Honestly, less than the taxes. Land out there doesn't move. My advice, and I don't charge for it, is to sign a disclaimer of interest and let it go. Save yourself the heartache and the bus fare. Odessa stood in the little glass booth and looked out at the reading room, at the old men asleep over newspapers, and the kid doing homework and the woman charging her phone in the corner the same as her. She thought about the word grandfather. She thought about how she had never once in 19 years been able to answer the question, "Where are you from?" "I want to see it," she said. The lawyer was quiet a moment. "It's your right," he said finally. "The keys are here in an envelope with your name on them. I'll leave word you're coming." She spent $11 of her $31 on a bus ticket, north, and did not let herself think about the 20 that were left. She had gone looking for a building. She had no idea she was about to find out she came from somewhere. The bus north took most of a day. The city thinned into strip malls, then into farmland, then into low green hills folded one behind the other, like something a giant had crumpled and half smoothed out. Odessa pressed her forehead to the glass and watched a country she had never seen go by. Silos, round hay bales in cut fields, a church, a feed store, a gas station, then nothing for 20 minutes. Renfrew was not much when the bus finally reached it. One main street of brick storefronts, half of them still open. A hardware store, a bank, a diner, a bakery, with steam on the windows and a hand-painted sign. The bus let her off in front of the bank and pulled away, and then it was just Odessa and her duffel bag on a sidewalk in a town that had never heard of her. The lawyer's office was closed by the time she got there. A note taped to the door, with her name on it and an envelope in the mail slot inside that she could see but not reach. She would have to wait until morning. She had $20 and no plan for the night, and the cold was coming down out of the hills. The bakery was the only place with its lights still on. A bell over the door announced her. Inside it was warm and smelled like every good thing she had ever been too broke to buy. A woman was wiping down the glass case, 60s maybe, gray hair pinned up, flour worn into the creases of her hands like it lived there. She looked up and took in Odessa in one glance. The duffel, the thin coat, the tiredness, and did not do the thing most people did, which was to decide something unkind. "We're near about closed, hon," the woman said, "but the coffee's still hot, and the day-olds are half price, which at this hour is free. Sit down before you fall down." Odessa sat. The woman set a coffee in front of her and a roll the size of her fist and waved off the $2 she tried to put on the counter. "You're not from here," the woman said. It was not a question. No. Passing through? I don't know yet. Odessa wrapped both hands around the coffee. "I'm looking for a lawyer's office. It's about a property I guess I inherited, from a man named Emmett Rourke." The rag in the woman's hand went still. She set it down on the counter and looked at Odessa the way you look at something you thought you would never see. Her eyes moved over Odessa's face, slow, searching, and whatever she found there made her put one hand flat against her chest. "Rourke," the woman said. Her voice had changed. "Honey, in this town that name is stamped on half the bread we ever ate." "You knew him?" "Everybody knew him." The woman came around the counter and sat down across from her without being asked. "I bought flour off Emmett Rourke for 40 years. My mother bought it off him before me. That mill fed this whole valley back when it ran." She stopped. She was still studying Odessa's face. "How do you come to be his heir? He didn't have anybody. That was the sad thing about him. That man didn't have a soul left in the world." "He had a daughter," Odessa said. "A long time ago. She was my mother." The woman's hand went back to her chest. Her eyes filled, quick and sudden, and she blinked hard against it. "Nell," she whispered. "You're Nell's girl." Odessa had never in her life heard anyone say her mother's name like it meant something. In the file, it was just a line. A woman named Klein, deceased. Nobody had ever leaned across a table with tears standing in their eyes and said it soft like a prayer. "You knew my mother," Odessa said, and her own voice came out unsteady. "I knew her when she was a girl running up and down that mill in bare feet." The woman reached across and put her floury hand over Odessa's without asking, and Odessa let her, which surprised them both. "Faye," the woman said, "my name's Faye, and I don't know where you've been all these years, child, but you have got Nell's exact chin. And if Emmett Rourke could see you sitting in my shop right now, it would have added 10 years to his life." "He died," Odessa said, "in the spring. I never met him. I didn't even know he existed until 4 days ago." Faye sat back. Something moved across her face, grief and anger and something older than both. "No," she said quietly. "You wouldn't have. He looked for you, you know, for years. Kept saying he had family out there somewhere he'd lost track of. We all figured it was an old man's sorrow talking." She shook her head. "Lord, and here you are, walked right in off the evening bus." "What was he like?" Odessa asked. She had never gotten to ask that question about anyone who belonged to her. They thought about it. Quiet, stubborn as a fence post, and he never once let a hungry person walk past that mill without a sack of flour, whether they had a dime to their name or not. There's people in this town wouldn't have eaten some winters if not for Emmett Rourke, and he'd have been mortified to hear me say so. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. "That's the kind of man you come from, child. I want you to know that before you know anything else." Faye would not let her spend money on a room. There was a couch in the back of the bakery, she said, and a bathroom with a working shower, and it was warm because the ovens never fully cooled. And a girl who had ridden a bus all day to bury the idea that she came from nobody was not going to sleep in a stairwell in Faye's town. And that was the end of it. Odessa lay that night on a bakery couch under a borrowed quilt, listening to the ovens tick as they cooled, and could not sleep for the strangeness of being somewhere a name of hers meant something. In the morning, she got the envelope from the lawyer, and inside it was a single brass key, old and heavy, worn smooth by a hand that was not hers. On a loop of leather cord, there was an address and a hand-drawn map because the mill was too far out for street signs. Faye drove her. The road left town and followed the creek out into the hills, gravel then dirt, past 2 farms and a stand of pines, until it dropped into a little hollow where the water ran fast and cold over stones. And there it was. The mill sat where the creek widened, a tall building of dark timber and gray stone, 3 stories, with a great wooden wheel on its flank as high as the roofline. The wheel was still. Below it, the channel that had once fed the buckets, the race, was choked with leaves and silt. Its windows were dark, and moss had climbed the north wall. A wooden sign hung crooked over the big door, the paint nearly gone, but Odessa could still read the 2 words carved into it, Rourke's Mill. Her name, or a name that should have been hers, carved into a sign over a door before she was born. "I'll wait in the truck," Faye said gently. "Some things a person ought to do by herself, but I'm right here." Odessa walked to the door alone. The creak was loud in the quiet. She fit the old brass key into the lock, and it took some working, but the tumblers gave with a heavy click, and the door swung inward on hinges that groaned like they were waking up. Inside, the light came down in dusty bars from the high windows. The air smelled of old wood and cold stone, and, underneath it all, faint and sweet, the ghost of ground grain, as if the walls themselves had soaked up 50 years of flour and would never fully let it go. The great machinery stood all around her, silent. Wooden gears the size of wagon wheels, a pair of enormous round millstones, one bedded in the floor, one hung above it, leather belts gone slack, bins and chutes and a long workbench down one wall. And on that workbench, a life sat waiting exactly where its owner had left it. A tin cup sat there with an inch of coffee gone to dust in the bottom. His reading glasses were folded on top of an open notebook, a pencil laid in the crease of the page. A wool coat hung on a peg by the bench, and when the door's draft touched it, the sleeve swayed once and went still. Odessa stood very still herself. This was not a haunted place. It was worse than that, and better. It was a room where a man had set down his glasses, expecting to pick them up again, and never had. She did not touch anything at first. She walked the floor slowly, letting the size of it settle on her, this thing that was somehow hers. Her boots left prints in the fine dust. On the far wall, a wooden stair climbed to the 2nd floor, to the living quarters where, she would learn, Emmett Rourke had spent the last 40 years of his life alone. She went up. The quarters were small and plain and clean, cleaner than the mill floor. He had let the workshop gather dust, it seemed. But he had swept his own rooms right up to the end. A kitchen with a wood stove. A worn chair sat by a window that looked out on the still wheel. One whole wall was shelves, crowded with books and jars and small carved things. There were 2 bedrooms off the main room. The first was clearly his, a narrow-made bed, a dresser, a shaving mirror. The second door was shut. Odessa put her hand on it, and something in her chest went tight, though she could not have said why. She opened it. The room was ready for someone. That was the only way to describe it. The bed was made up fresh, the quilt turned down at the corner the way you do when you are expecting a guest. A lamp sat on the little table beside it, and a book, and a folded towel. A shelf held a few things chosen by someone who did not know her, but had tried to imagine her. There was a hairbrush still in its packaging, a small radio, and a potted plant, long dead now, that someone had watered until they no longer could. And on the pillow, set square in the center where she could not miss it, was a cloth flour sack, clean and folded flat. Odessa crossed the room on legs that did not feel like her own, and picked it up. 2 words were written across the front of the sack in pencil, in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who did not write often and wanted to get it right. For Odessa. He had known her name, not Klein. Odessa. He had made up a bed and set out a lamp and a hairbrush and a dead man's hope, and he had written her name on a sack of flour and left it on a pillow in a locked mill for a granddaughter he had never once laid eyes on. In a room he must have known she might never come to find. She sat down on the edge of the made bed with the sack in both hands, and for the first time since she was a very small girl, Odessa Klein had absolutely no idea who she was. She sat there a long time, until the light in the little room shifted and the creak outside kept up its steady talking, and Faye finally came looking for her, climbing the wooden stair and stopping in the doorway when she saw Odessa on the bed with the flour sack in her lap. Faye did not ask what it was. She read the 2 penciled words from across the room, and her mouth pressed thin. "He made that bed up 2 years ago," Faye said quietly. "Told me he was expecting company someday. I thought the poor man was losing his grip." She came and sat beside Odessa, the old bed creaking under them both. "I owe you an apology I don't rightly know how to give. All of us thought he was just a lonely old man telling himself stories, and the whole time he was telling the truth. I want to stay," Odessa said. "A few days. I need to understand what this is." Faye looked like she might argue. The mill was cold and far from town, and no place for a girl alone. But she must have seen something set in Odessa's face, because instead she nodded. "Then you'll do it right," Faye said. "I'll bring you a proper mattress and a lantern and enough food that you don't starve out here being stubborn. The wood stove works." Emmett kept it going right to the end. She stood and smoothed her apron. "And you'll come to the shop when you get lonesome. Which you will. This valley gets awful quiet at night." By evening, Odessa had a bed she could sleep in, a lamp, a box of groceries she had tried and failed to pay for, and the whole of Rourke's mill to herself. When Faye's truck had rattled off up the road, the silence came down complete, and Odessa found she did not mind it. She had spent years in rooms full of strangers. Alone in a building that carried her own name was a different kind of quiet. She lit the lamp and went back down to the mill floor. The open notebook was still on the workbench under the folded reading glasses, exactly where its owner had left it. In the morning she had been too shaken to look. Now she moved the glasses aside and turned the lamp toward the page. It was a ledger, column after column in the same careful pencil hand as the flour sack. A date, a name, an amount of flour, in pounds or in sacks, and then a third column, and in that column, over and over the same 2 words, "No charge." She turned back through the pages, and they went on and on. Names she did not know, dates that climbed backward through years and then through decades, whole winters where the no charge column ran down the page unbroken. Somewhere near the middle, the ink changed from pencil to pen and back again, and the handwriting got younger, steadier, the further back she went. She did not understand yet what she was holding. She thought it might be debts he was owed. It would be a while before she understood it was the opposite. A man had spent 50 years keeping a careful record of everyone he had ever fed for free. Not so they would owe him, but so no one would ever have to feel like charity. He wrote their names down the way you write down something you mean to honor. One entry near the bottom of a page from a hard winter caught her eye, a family name, and beside it, 6 sacks over 3 months, no charge, and then a small note squeezed into the margin in that same pencil. Kids looked thin. Didn't ask, just left it on the porch. Whoever the man was who wrote that, he had not wanted anyone to know he had noticed, not even the ledger. She was still bent over it when she heard the footsteps on the gravel outside. They were slow and uneven, a shuffle and a tap, a shuffle and a tap. Odessa straightened, her heart going quick. The door was unlocked. She had not thought to bolt it. It swung open, and an old man stood in the gap, leaning hard on a cane, a wool cap in his free hand. He was tall once, she could tell, though age had folded him down. Dark-skinned, white-bearded, with deep lines and eyes gone soft and roomy. He had walked up the creek road in the cold, and he was breathing hard from it. He saw her, and he went absolutely still. The cane trembled under his hand. His mouth opened and shut. For a moment, Odessa thought he might fall, and she started toward him, but he put up one hand to stop her, and he just looked at her, up and down, the way you look at a thing you have prayed for and never expected. "Lord have mercy," the old man whispered. "You've got Nell's hands." Odessa looked down at her own hands without meaning to. "You knew my mother," she said. "Knew her." He had to stop and breathe. "Child, I bounced your mother on my knee. I taught her to skip stones off that race out there before she was tall enough to see over the sill." His eyes were streaming now, and he did not seem to notice or care. "I'm Amos. Amos worked this mill alongside Emmett Rourke for near on 50 years. He was the closest thing to a brother I ever had. And you?" He shook his head. "You're the ghost he chased his whole life. And here you are, standing in it." She got him into the chair by the cold hearth and lit the stove and made coffee the way Faye had shown her. And slowly the old man got his breath and his composure back, though every few minutes he would look at her again and have to look away. His eyes kept drifting to the mill floor below them, to the great still stones and the slack belts, and something in his face worked as he looked. "Years I heard those stones turn," he said. "You get so you feel it in your teeth. Then Emmett got too weak to raise the gate, and it went quiet, and I tell you, this whole valley felt the quiet." He looked back at her. "You have no idea what you're standing in, girl, but you will." "He never gave up on you," Amos said. "You understand that? Folks in town thought he was a sad old fool, but Emmett knew he had a granddaughter out in the world somewhere. He just could not find her, not for lack of trying. That man spent money he did not have on people who promised to find you and never did." "Why couldn't he find me?" Odessa said. "I was right there. I was in the system my whole life. Anyone could have looked me up." Amos was quiet. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "That's a longer story than I've got wind for tonight," he said finally. "And it's not all mine to tell. Some of it's your mother's. Some of it he only pieced together at the very end." He looked at her, and there was something careful in it, something protective. "It's a story that's going to hurt you, girl. Are you sure you want it all at once?" "I've waited 19 years, Odessa said. "I can wait for the rest, but I'm not leaving until I have it." Amos smiled for the first time, and it changed his whole face. "No," he said, "I don't expect you are. You've got his stubbornness on top of her hands. God help this valley." He set the cup down. "Come by my place tomorrow. It's the gray house at the bottom of the hill you passed it coming in. I'll tell you what I know, and I'll show you the rest. There's things of your grandfather's I've been keeping, things he'd want you to have." He would not let her walk him home, though she worried about him on the dark road. He said he had walked that road 10,000 times, and it had not killed him yet. At the door he stopped and put one big trembling hand on her shoulder. "He set a place for you at every meal," Amos said. 40 years. An empty chair and a plate he never filled. I used to tell him to quit tormenting himself." His voice broke. "I'm glad he didn't listen to me. I'm so glad he didn't listen." Then he went out into the dark shuffle and tap, and left her alone with the ledger and the lamp and the sound of the creek. The man came the next morning, before she had even gone to see Amos. She heard the engine first, a big diesel truck laboring down the mill road, and then a door slammed and a voice called out across the yard, "Hello, the mill. Anybody in there?" Odessa opened the door. A man stood in the yard in a canvas work coat, mid-50s, thick through the shoulders, with a clipboard in one hand and the flat measuring look of someone used to being the most important person at any table. A second truck idled behind his, lettered on the door with the name of a building supply and storage company. He was as surprised to see her as she was wary of him. "Well," he said, "you're not who I expected. I'm Garrett Vane. I own the supply yard in town. And I've been keeping the county off this parcel for 2 years, so I suppose I've got some claim to know who's living in it." "I'm the owner," Odessa said. "It was left to me." Vane's eyebrows went up a fraction. He looked at her, at the mill behind her, at the duffel bag she had not fully unpacked visible through the door. "Emmett's heir," he said slowly. "Huh. He always swore he had one. I'll be honest with you, miss. I never believed it." He tapped the clipboard against his leg. "Then you should hear this from me instead of from a notice on the door. There is $9,400 in back taxes owed on this land. The county's putting it up at the tax sale the third week of October. If that money's not paid, the parcel sells to the highest bidder, and I intend to be the highest bidder." "Why?" Odessa said. "Because it's a hazard and an eyesore, and it's been rotting into that creek for 20 years. He said it plainly, without heat. I want to level it and put in storage units and a gravel lot. It's good land going to waste." He must have seen her face, because his own softened by a degree which cost him something. "Look, I'm not the bad guy in this. That building is going to come down, whether you cry about it or not. The kindest thing I can do is offer to buy it from you now, before the taxes eat it. I'll give you $4,000 cash and take the whole headache off your hands." "That's $4,000 more than you had a week ago, and you can be gone before the frost." $1,000. It was a fortune. It was more money than Odessa had ever held in her life. She could see it. The door had opened, the room she could rent, the fresh start with nobody in it who had ever failed her. "I'll think about it," she heard herself say. "Don't think too long." Vane climbed back into his truck. He paused with the door open. "I knew your grandfather 40 years, miss. He was a stubborn old man who could not tell the difference between holding on and being held on to. Try not to make the same mistake he did." Then he was gone, and the diesel faded up the road, and Odessa stood in the yard with $4,000 and a deadline hanging in the cold air where his words had been. The worst part was that the offer made sense. She had spent her whole life learning to take the sure thing over the pretty one. $4,000 was a bed with her name on the lease, and a door that locked, and nobody's charity. The mill was a cold ruin, a stack of taxes she could not pay, and a dead man's guilt she had not asked to carry. Any counselor she had ever sat across from would have told her to sign the paper and go. She went back inside instead. The reason was not one she could have put into words yet. All she knew was that the word grandfather had cost her something to say out loud for the first time, and she was not ready to sell it back for $4,000 to a man who wanted to pour gravel over it. She did not go to Amos's that day. She could not have said why, except that she was afraid of what he would tell her, and she needed to go into it braced. Instead, she went back inside and she started methodically. Go through the mill her grandfather had left her, drawer by drawer, box by box, the way she had gone through every temporary room she had ever lived in, looking for the thing that would tell her whether she could stay. She found it late in the afternoon, in the second bedroom, in a hat box on the shelf above the made bed. The box was full of envelopes. There were dozens of them, more than dozens, bundled with kitchen twine into stacks by year. She lifted the first bundle out, and the twine was soft with handling, worn limp by a man who had tied and untied it 1,000 times. Every envelope was addressed in the same careful pencil. And across nearly every one, stamped in red or scrawled by some clerk's hand, were the words that had sent them all home again. Return to sender. No such address. Moved. Left no forwarding. She sat down on the floor with the box. The oldest bundle was addressed to Nell Rourke at a city Odessa had never lived in, and the dates went back before she was born. Then the name changed. Nell Klein at another address, then another, then another, each one crossed out and rewritten in a hand growing older and more desperate. He had chased her mother across the map for years, one letter at a time, and every letter had come back unopened. He had written her one letter for every year she was alive, and never gotten to mail a single one that reached her. Odessa's hands were shaking. She made herself keep going. Near the bottom of the box, the bundles changed. One envelope had come back not with a clerk's careless stamp, but with an official notice paper clipped to it, the kind a government office sends. She unfolded it. Her eyes could not take in all the words, only the ones that mattered. The addressee, Nell Klein, was deceased. The letter could not be delivered. That was how he had learned. Not a phone call, not a knock on the door. A birthday letter to his daughter, come home in the mail with a form clipped to it telling him she was already years in the ground. Odessa put her hand over her mouth. Below that, the letters were no longer addressed to Nell at all. They had no address on them, none, because there was nowhere left to send them. They simply said, in the careful pencil, to my granddaughter, wherever you are. He had kept writing. To a girl whose name he did not know. in a place he could not find. He had gone on writing one letter a year and dropping them in a box because he had no one else in the world to write to. And then, in the last bundle, the newest, the letters changed one final time. They said her name, Odessa. Odessa Klein. He had learned it. Somewhere in his last year, some tracer he had paid, some record that had finally lined up, had put her name in his hands at last, and the letters in the final bundle were addressed to her, by name, in a hand gone shaky and thin. The last one was dated 3 weeks before he died. It had a stamp on it, ready to mail. He had gotten as far as the stamp. Her name was there on the envelope in his shaky hand, the stamp licked and pressed down under a dying man's thumb. He had just never made it to the road. She did not sleep that night. She sat up with the last letter, the one with the stamp already on it. And in the morning, she walked down the hill to the gray house at the bottom, because she could not carry the questions alone another hour. Amos was already on his porch with 2 mugs of coffee when she came down the hill, one of them poured and waiting, like he had been sure she would come early. The house behind him was worn soft at the edges, a good house once, going quietly to seed the way a house does when one old man lives in it alone. A ramp had been built over the front steps, sturdy but never painted. He saw her looking at it. "Heart's no good," he said, before she could ask. "Doctor says I ought to be in town where somebody can look in on me. I keep telling him I've got a hill to die on, and I intend to use it." He handed her a mug. "Sit down, Nell's girl. I promised you the rest of it. It's not going to be easy to hear." So she sat, and Amos told her. He told her that Emmett Rourke had lost his wife when Nell was 9, and that it had broken something in him that never set right. He had raised the girl alone and clumsy and fierce, loving her more than his own life and never once knowing how to say it. And Nell had grown up the same as him, proud and quick-tempered and soft underneath where nobody could see. They were too much alike, Amos said. That was the whole tragedy of it. 2 people who'd have laid down in the road for each other, and neither one could bend an inch. When Nell was 18, she got pregnant by a boy who left before the leaves turned. And Emmett, who was frightened out of his mind, who had already lost one woman he loved and could not stand the thought of watching his daughter struggle, said the wrong thing. He did not throw her out. Amos was firm on that. But he stood in that mill with his fear coming out of him as anger. And he told her the boy was no good, and she was throwing her life away. And he said it in a voice that a frightened 18-year-old girl heard as, "You have shamed me." He meant help me keep you safe, Amos said. She heard get out. And she had his pride, so she got out, left that same night, walked to the county road with 1 bag, and never set foot in this valley again. Odessa sat very still. He could have gone after her. He should have. He'd tell you that himself, if he could. He waited a week for her to come home, because that's what he'd have done. Come home when his temper cooled. And she waited for him to come find her, because that's what she needed. And a week turned into a month, turned into 30 years. Amos's voice was rough, both of them standing on opposite sides of a door, each one waiting for the other to knock. That's how you lose a whole family, child, not with some great cruelty. Just 2 stubborn people, and a silence that gets too big to cross. The rest came out slower. How Nell had changed her name to Klein, buried the Rourke in her like a stone she was ashamed of. How, in one soft moment after the baby came, she had mailed her father a single photograph, a newborn in a hospital blanket, with a name and a date on the back, and no letter and no address he could answer. How Emmett had carried that photograph in his shirt pocket for the rest of his life, until it wore through at the creases. He wrote back the same day, Amos said, to the postmark on the envelope. Came back no such address. She'd already moved on. And he never got another word. Not one. He didn't even know if the baby had lived. That was the part that sat down hard in Odessa's chest. For 19 years she had believed nobody in the world knew she existed. And all that time, 200 miles north, a man had a photograph of her as a newborn worn soft in his pocket, and no way on earth to find her. Amos got up, slow and careful, and went inside and came back with a wooden crate. It held notebooks, a dozen of them, the same careful pencil as the ledger, and the letters. He kept everything, Amos said. These are his. I want you to have them, but I want to tell you the end of it myself, because it's the part that'll save you or ruin you, and you ought to hear it from somebody who loves you before you read it alone." She waited. Last year, when Emmett knew his heart was failing, he spent near the last of his money on a man who finds people. A real one this time, not the vultures who'd taken his cash before. "And that man found your mother." Amos stopped. Found her death record is what he found. Nell had been gone 12 years by then, and in that same file was a baby went into the state's care at 3 years old, under the name Klein, a girl. "Odessa, he found me," she whispered. "He found you. Last winter, got your name, and got the county you were in, and he sat right there where you're sitting, and he cried like I've never seen a man cry, out of joy and out of grief both. Because he'd found you, and he was too weak by then to travel the length of his own driveway." Amos wiped his face with his sleeve. "He made up your room. He wrote your name on a sack of his flour. Got a letter as far as a stamp even. And then his heart quit, 3 weeks later, and he died knowing your name and never once getting to say it to your face. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his own shirt and took out something small and soft, and he held it out to her in his big trembling hand. It was the photograph. The one Nell had mailed. A newborn in a hospital blanket, the color gone brown, the paper worn through at every crease and mended on the back with a strip of tape yellowed with age. "He carried this 30 years, Amos said. "I took it off him the day he passed because I could not stand the thought of it going in the ground with him, when the whole reason he kept it was so it could someday get back to you. That's you, girl. 3 days old, the only picture your grandfather ever had, and he wore it out with looking." Odessa took the photograph, and her thumb found the soft places his thumb had made, and for a while she could not speak at all. Think about that for a moment, whoever is out there listening to Odessa's story. A man who spent 30 years not knowing if his grandchild was alive, who found her at the very end, and ran out of days before he could knock on the door. If you have made it this far into her story, take a second and subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. This is where a girl who came from nothing starts to find out exactly how much she came from. Because here is the thing Amos said next, and it is the thing that turned her around. "He didn't leave you a mill, girl." The old man leaned forward on his cane. "He left you away to never be hungry, and never let anybody near you be hungry either. That's what a mill is. That's what he was. You go read those books, and you'll see. A man poured his whole broken heart into feeding people because he couldn't feed the one person he wanted to. Don't you let Garrett Vane pour gravel over that." She took the crate home and read her grandfather in his own words until the lamp burned low. And then, in Nell's old room, the one made up for a guest, she found the other half of it. Behind the books on the shelf, pushed to the back where a grieving father must have put it and could not bear to move, was a girl's journal with the initials N.R. pressed into the cover. Nell's, kept from before she left. Odessa read her mother that night for the first time in her life. She read a proud, frightened girl who loved a baby fiercely and was too ashamed to come home. "I'll go back when I've made something of myself," Nell had written, over and over, a promise to a father she was sure had stopped wanting her. "When Odessa's old enough to be proud of me, when I've got something to show for it." She had been saving up her whole small life for a homecoming she kept believing she had time to make. There was an entry from a hard week that Odessa read 3 times. "Called the mill today," Nell had written, "stood at the payphone with a quarter in my hand for 10 minutes, heard it ring twice and hung up. What would I even say? Sorry doesn't fix 5 years. 200 miles and a silence, and a girl who could not spend 1 quarter, and a father who would have crawled the whole distance on his hands if that phone had only rung a 3rd time. They had been reaching for each other across the exact same emptiness, and neither had ever known the other one was reaching too. She never made it. The last entry was thin and tired and written by someone already sick. "I want Odessa to know she came from good people," it said. "When she's old enough, I'll tell her about the mill. I'll take her there myself." Neither of them had made it to the road. Odessa put the 2 of them together in her mind, the father and the daughter, each one certain the other did not want them, each one waiting on the far side of a silence, and she understood something that unlocked her. She had spent 19 years believing she was unwanted, and she had been wrong the entire time. Unwanted was never once what she had been. What she had been was hidden, buried under a mother's shame and a grandfather's grief, and a name that was never really hers, by two people who would have crossed any distance to reach her if pride and time had not stood in the road. She was not nobody's child. She was the thing two stubborn, loving, ruined people had each been trying to get back to when they died. The town started coming the next day. It began with Faye, who drove out with a hot dish, and the news that word had gotten around Renfrew that Emmett Rourke's granddaughter had come home, and that the whole valley was beside itself. By afternoon, there were 3 trucks in the yard. They came shy, most of them, hats in hands. An old woman who had gone to school with Nell, a farmer whose name Odessa recognized from the ledger, a young mother with 2 kids who set a basket of eggs on the step and said her own mother would not have made it through the winter of some year past without Emmett's flour, and she just wanted his granddaughter to know it. They did not come with pity. That was what undid her. They came the way you come to family you have not met, with food and with stories and with their sleeves already rolled up. A man looked at the choked mill race and said he had a boy with a mini excavator who could clear that in an afternoon for the cost of the diesel. A woman looked at the dusty stones and said her grandfather had dressed millstones once and she thought she remembered how. One lean older farmer in a seed company cap stood a long time staring up at the wheel, then came and found her. "You get those stones turning," he said, "and you'll have a customer the first day. I've got 60 acres of wheat and no mill closer than the county line since your grandfather quit. I've been trucking my grain 2 hours each way for 15 years. He looked almost embarrassed. Half the growers in this valley would rather grind here. Emmett's flour built its name for 100 years. That name's still worth something. You'd be surprised. Odessa had come here believing the mill was a dead thing, a ruin worth less than its taxes. It was the first time anyone had spoken about it like it might have a future instead of only a past. "Why?" Odessa asked Faye, standing in the yard while people she had never met walked her ruin like it was a barn raising. "Why do they care this much?" "Because he cared this much," Faye said. "For 50 years, you don't get to be that kind of man in a small town and have nobody remember." She squeezed Odessa's arm. "They're not doing it for you, hon. Not yet. They don't know you. They're doing it for him. But give it time. They'll do it for you soon enough." Garrett Vane came back on a Thursday. He parked his diesel in the yard, and this time the yard had 6 other trucks in it, and he stood looking at all of them for a long moment before he came to find her. "You've stirred something up," he said. It was not quite an accusation. "I've had 4 people in my store this week tell me I'm a heartless so-and-so for wanting this parcel, as though I invented the tax code," he set his jaw. "My offer's still good. In fact, I'll do you better. 5,000. But it comes off the table the day of the sale, and I want you to hear me clear, miss. These good people cleaning your mill race, they can't pay $9,400 in taxes for you. Goodwill doesn't grind wheat. When October comes, that county wants cash, and cash is the one thing this valley has never had much of. I'm the only cash you're going to see." He was not wrong. That was the terrible thing about Garrett Vane. He was hard, and he was blunt, and he was also, in the plainest arithmetic, correct. Odessa looked at him. She looked at the crate of her grandfather's notebooks on the porch, and the people in her yard, and the great still wheel that had not turned in years. "Everybody keeps telling me it's worthless," she said. "Not one of you told me it was mine." Vane frowned. "That's sentiment talking. Sentiment doesn't pay taxes." "Maybe not." She folded her arms against the cold. "But I've had exactly one thing in my whole life that was mine and not the state's and not a stranger's. It's standing right behind me. So here's my answer, and it's the last time I'll give it. I'm not selling you my grandfather's mill so you can pour a parking lot on it. I'm going to pay the taxes, and I'm going to make it run." For a moment, something crossed Vane's face that was not contempt. It might have been surprise. It might have been something older and more buried than that. "You don't have $9,000, he said quietly. "No," Odessa said. "Not yet." She did not know how she was going to get it. She had $20 in her pocket, and a mill full of rust and a tax sale coming down on her like weather, and she had just told the only man with money in 40 miles to keep it. Every practical bone in her body was screaming that she had made a terrible mistake. But behind her, the mill race was already half cleared, and a stranger's boy was singing along to a radio in the cab of an excavator, and somewhere in a crate on the porch, a dead man had written down in careful pencil exactly how to bring a stopped mill back to life. She turned her back on Garrett Vane and his $5,000, and she went to go find out how. How turned out to be written down. All of it. Her grandfather's notebooks were not a diary. They were an instruction manual, page after careful page, drawn and labeled by a man who must have known his hands would not always be there to do the work. How to raise the head gate. How to clear the race without collapsing the bank, which wooden gears he had replaced and when, and how to check the rest for rot. He had even drawn the great wheel in cross-section, every bucket numbered, with a note in the margin that made Odessa's throat close. If you are reading this, it means somebody is trying to bring her back to life. Good. She was always worth it. So Odessa went to work, and she did not go alone. The man's boy came with the little excavator and cleared the mill race in a single long afternoon, hauling out 15 years of silt and rotted leaves until the water ran clear and cold down the channel again. Faye came out most mornings with bread and stayed to scrub decades of dust off the bins. And Amos came every day, driven up the hill now by a nephew because his heart would not let him walk it, and he sat in the chair by the head gate and taught. "Your grandfather could dress a stone blindfolded," Amos said. "I watched him do it 40 years. I can't hold the bill anymore, these hands are done. But I can tell you where every furrow goes. You'll be my hands, girl. We'll do it together." Dressing the stones meant recutting the grooves in the great round millstones, the shallow channels that did the actual work of shearing the grain into flour. The runner stone had to be lifted off its bed with a block and tackle and turned over. All 1,000 pounds of it, and Odessa spent 3 days on her knees with a mill bill in her blistered hands, following the pattern Amos called out in the diagrams Emmett had left, cutting each furrow true. It was slow, brutal, exacting work, and Odessa found she was good at it. That was the thing nobody had ever told her about herself. In every group home she had drifted through, there had been one place she was calm, and it was the wood shop, with a tool in her hand and a problem in front of her that would hold still and let her solve it. She had a feel for how things fit. She had thought it was nothing. Now she knelt in her grandfather's mill and understood it was the one piece of him that had reached her after all, carried in the blood, waiting the whole time for a reason to matter. When they found the broken cog in the spur gear, a wooden tooth snapped clean off the big drive wheel. The men shook their heads and talked about ordering a part from a specialist 3 states away, money and weeks they did not have. Odessa looked at the notebook where Emmett had written the exact species of wood he used for the gear teeth, and why. Then she went out to his workbench, found the seasoned blank he had left there ready, and carved a new tooth by hand, fitting and shaving and fitting again until it seated into the wheel like it had grown there. Amos watched her do it and had to look away. "He'd have given 10 years to see that," the old man said thickly. "You've got his hands. You've got both of them." Her hands and his. The work took the better part of a month, and it was never once hers alone. Different people came on different days, whoever could spare an afternoon. A retired millwright drove 2 hours from the next county when he heard the news, and spent a whole weekend teaching Odessa how to true the gears. Teenagers hauled brush out of the race. A church group scraped and repainted the great wheel one bright Sunday. Somebody's grandmother sat in the sun snapping beans and telling stories about Nell as a girl, until Odessa knew her own mother better secondhand from that valley than she had ever known her firsthand. Nobody kept track of hours. Nobody sent a bill. She had spent her whole life certain that people helped you only until they found out what it cost them. She was being slowly, patiently proven wrong, one afternoon at a time. They tried the wheel once before they were ready, just the two of them, on a gray afternoon when Odessa could not stand the waiting any longer. She raised the gate a few inches. The water came. The wheel began to turn. Then a sound tore through the mill that stopped her heart, a shriek of metal and a bang like a gunshot, and she slammed the gate down and ran inside to find smoke curling off the main bearing and a gear knocked half off its shaft. For a long moment she only stood there, every blister, every borrowed favor, and the thing had nearly torn itself apart the first time she asked it to work. "I can't do this," she said, and her voice cracked on it. "I don't know what I'm doing, Amos. I'm going to break the one thing he left me." Amos let her stand in it a moment, then he pointed his cane at the open notebook on the bench. "Page 40, he said. He burned that same bearing out a long time back, wrote down exactly how he fixed it and exactly how he felt while he did. Go on, read it." She read it. In the margin of page 40, under the diagram, her grandfather had written, in the pencil she now knew like her own handwriting, 5 words. "Felt like quitting today. Didn't." And under that, 1 line more. "A mill teaches you patience or it teaches you nothing." She fixed the bearing. It took 2 more days. She did not quit. In the evenings, when the others had gone, Odessa read the notebooks by lamplight, and one night near the back of the last one she found the thing her grandfather had most wanted to say, written large and underlined, a creed for whoever came after him. "A mill doesn't grind for the miller," he had written. "It grinds for whoever's hungry. Don't you ever forget which one you are." She read it a dozen times, then she copied it out on a card and propped it above the workbench, where she would see it every day. She had started stopping at the gray house at the bottom of the hill, on her way in and out. At first, she told herself it was for the stories. Then she admitted it was because Amos was failing and living alone, and nobody else was looking in. She brought him meals from Faye's. She filled his wood box and learned which pills he was supposed to take, and made sure he took them. He grumbled that he did not need minding. She minded him anyway. It was the first time in her life she had been the one doing the taking care of instead of the one the state assigned a caretaker to, and she found she would rather do it than almost anything. The wheel was ready before she was. They had freed it from its frozen axle with penetrating oil and patience, greased the bearings, replaced 2 rotted buckets. It hung there over the clear running race, whole and waiting, and all it needed was for someone to raise the gate and let the water come. But raising the gate meant it was real, and once it was real, the other problem was still there, the one no amount of work could fix. $9,400, due at the county courthouse in 8 days. She had found some of it. Behind the wood stove, wrapped in oilcloth, Emmett had left a coffee can with a little over $3,000 in worn bills. The whole of his savings, every cent he had not spent on men who promised to find her. It sat on the table like an accusation and a gift, and it was not enough. It was not even close. She was sitting with the coffee can and the tax notice on the night she made herself open the ledger again, the great book of names and no charge, and she started reading it not for comfort, but for a reason she could not have explained. She found the name on the 3rd page from the front. Vane. Winter, a year written in her grandfather's younger hand, a family name she knew, and beside it, 2 sacks a week from December through March, no charge, and a note in the margin. Man got laid off at the quarry. 4 kids. Proud. Leave it on the step before light so he doesn't have to see me do it. Odessa sat very still. Then she took the ledger and she drove Faye's borrowed truck into town, and she walked into the building supply yard and set the open book on the counter in front of Garrett Vane. "Your name's in here," she said. "Winter of that year, 2 sacks a week, all season, no charge." She turned the book so he could read it. "He fed you. You and 3 other kids, before light so your father wouldn't have to watch a man see him take charity. He never said a word about it, did he?" Vane looked at the page for a long time. His hand came up and touched the name, his own name, in a dead man's pencil, and something in his face that had been set hard for 50 years came apart very quietly. "I was 6, he said finally. His voice had gone rough. "I remember flour on the porch and my dad crying at the kitchen table, and nobody ever telling me why." He did not look up. He never let on. 40 years I bought lumber nails off that old man and did business with him, and he never once, not one single time, held it over me. "That's who you're trying to pour a parking lot on," Odessa said. Not cruel, just true. Vane closed the ledger with great care, like it might break. When he looked up, his eyes were wet and furious, though the fury was not at her. "How much are you short?" he said. "I'm not asking you for charity," Odessa said. "I won't take it. He wouldn't have." "I know he wouldn't. That's not what this is." Vane pushed the ledger back across the counter to her. "This is a debt, miss. It's been sitting on that page since I was 6 years old, and I am the last living Vane who can pay it, and I would sooner die than let it go to the grave unsettled. That is not charity. That is a man squaring an account 50 years overdue. Your grandfather taught me the difference himself, apparently, and I was too dumb to know I'd learned it." He wiped his eyes with the back of a big hand. "How much?" She told him. He was quiet a moment, doing the arithmetic against what she had found and what the town could raise, and then he nodded once. A man who had made up his mind and would not be talked out of it. "You raise what you can that day," he said. "Whatever's left when the gavel would fall, I cover, not as a gift, as what my family owes yours." He almost smiled. "And I'll pull my bid. God help me, I'll probably tell that county board they ought to be ashamed for taxing the one thing this valley ever loved for free." They did it all on the same day. Word went out that Rourke's mill would grind again on a Saturday, 1 week before the tax sale, and that anyone who wanted flour should bring their grain and their neighbors and whatever they could spare. The valley came. Trucks lined the mill road for half a mile. The wheat farmer in the seed cap brought the first load of grain and paid in advance for a whole season of milling, and 3 more growers behind him did the same. And Fay set up a table and sold bread as fast as she could bake it, and children ran in the yard where a lonely old man had set an empty plate for 40 years. People kept coming up to Odessa all morning, shy to tell her what her grandfather had been to them. The young mother from the egg basket, whose family had eaten through a bad winter on his flour, an old man who said Emmett had ground his wedding bread and his father's funeral bread both. A woman pressed $40 into Odessa's hand and would not take it back. And then there was another woman behind her, and another, until Fay was keeping the money in a cigar box and had lost the count of it. None of them called it charity. They called it what it was. A whole valley finally getting to pay back a man who had never once let them, by giving it to the girl he had loved without ever getting to meet her. By the time the sun stood high, the cigar box and the milling contracts and Emmett's coffee can, all counted together, had come within a few $100s of the whole 9,400. And Garrett Vane stood at the back of the crowd with his checkbook already in his coat. At noon, with the whole valley watching, Odessa climbed to the head gate. Amos sat beside it in his chair, too weak to stand, one hand gripping hers. "Your grandfather's hand raised this gate 10,000 times," he said. "Now yours does. Go on, Nels girl. Wake her up." Odessa put her weight on the iron wheel, and it gave, and somewhere below her the water left the race and rushed the channel and struck the buckets of the great wheel for the first time in years. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the wheel groaned, a deep sound that came up through the timbers and into the souls of everyone standing there. And it moved. It turned. Water caught and spilled, and caught again, and the wheel came around slow and then sure. And inside the mill the wooden gears took up the turning, the pit wheel and the spur gear and the cob she had carved with her own hands. And the great runner stone began to spin above its bed. Amos was weeping openly. Fay had both hands pressed to her mouth. Garrett Vane stood at the back of the crowd with his cap off. Odessa poured the first grain into the hopper, and it ran down the chute into the turning stones. And for a moment, there was only the rumble and the waiting. Then the flour came. It came warm and fine and white from the meal spout. First flour ground at Rourke's mill in more years than some of the children watching had been alive. And it drifted up into the light, coming down through the high windows, and hung there, gold in the sun, dusting the shoulders and the hair and the upturned faces of a whole valley her grandfather had fed and never once let go hungry. Odessa caught it in her cupped hands. It was warm. It was still warm from the stones, from the turning, from the water and the wheel and the work, and she stood in the middle of the noise and the flour and the people, holding the first thing she had ever made that her grandfather had reached across his whole broken life to give her the chance to make, and she understood at last exactly what he had left inside for her. He had not left her a building. What he had left her was a way to feed people, the one trade in the world where the whole point of the work was that nobody near you ever went without. He had spent his last strength making sure that a girl who grew up with nothing would inherit not money, which runs out, but the standing power to see that no one else ever had to grow up as hungry as he was afraid she had. She turned and pressed the warm flour into Faye's hands, and Faye took it to her ovens, and within the hour, the whole valley was eating bread ground from Emmett Rourke's stones again, and Odessa stood in the doorway of a mill that was finally, after all those silent years, making its old sound. As winter loosened toward spring, the mill on the creek settled into a rhythm it had not known in a generation. The wheel turned most days now. Growers came down the road with their grain in the mornings, and Odessa ground it in the afternoons, and the whole hollow smelled of cut wheat and cold water. She had learned to read the stones with her fingertips, the way Amos taught her, to feel when they ran too close or too warm. The mill had taught her to patch a leather belt and set a hopper and judge good flour by letting it fall through her hand. She was 19 years old, and for the first time in her life she woke up in the same bed every morning and knew exactly where she was and what she was for. The days had a shape now. Growers came at first light, and there was always coffee going, and there was always somebody leaning on the doorframe telling her the news. Faye came Wednesdays for her baking flour and stayed to boss Odessa around her own kitchen. The seed-cap farmer brought his wheat, and more often than not a pie his wife had sent, and he had taken to calling Odessa the miller with not a trace of a joke in it, which was the proudest anyone had ever made her feel with a single word. Old customers who had trucked their grain 2 hours each way for 15 years came back, and more than one of them stood in the doorway and wept the first time they smelled fresh flour in that building again. Odessa had believed, back when she was small and moving from house to house, that the thing she wanted most in the world was to be left alone. She had been wrong about that too. What she had wanted was a door people knocked on because they were glad she was behind it. She had also, quietly, in the county office one Tuesday, changed her name. She did it without ceremony, just a form filled out and a small fee she could finally afford, and she walked out of that office, Odessa Rourke, which was the name that had been carved over the mill door before she was born. The name her mother had buried out of shame, the name a stubborn old man had gone to his grave still hoping to give her. The clerk asked if she was sure. She said she had never been more sure of anything. When she told Amos, he was quiet a moment, and then he reached over and took her hand in both of his. "You know what your grandfather used to tell folks in this valley when they got to feeling low and worthless," he said. He'd say, "Everybody comes from somewhere, even if somebody worked awful hard to make you forget where." Amos held onto her hand. "You're not from nothing, Odessa. You never were. You're from here. You're from him, and from Nell, and from this creek and these old stones, and don't you let anybody, your own self included, tell you different ever again." She had painted the sign herself. She had taken it down, sanded off 60 years of weather, and lettered the 2 words back on by hand in her grandfather's careful style. Rourke's Mill. When she hung it back over the door, Faye and Amos and half the valley were there, and nobody made a speech, and it was perfect. She had saved one thing for the day the sign went up. The last letter. The one with the stamp already on it. The one Emmett had gotten as far as the road with and no farther. She had carried it in her coat for weeks, unable to open it, because she knew that once she read it there would be no more of him coming, that this was the final time her grandfather would ever speak to her, and she wanted to be ready. That night, alone in the room he had made up for her, she finally opened it. His handwriting had gone thin and shaky by then, but it was still his. "Dear Odessa," it began. "I have started this letter 40 times and burned 39 of them in the stove. A man who never learned to say the important things out loud does not suddenly find them easy on paper. But I am running out of time to be a coward, so here it is. Plain. I am your grandfather. Your mother was my Nell, and I loved her more than my own breath, and I lost her because I was afraid. I said a hard thing when I meant a soft one, and I let a silence grow between us that I always meant to cross tomorrow. Tomorrow ran out. That is the only sign of I have ever really believed in since, waiting for tomorrow to say what you could say today. I looked for you for 30 years. I want you to know that. Not so you will feel you owe me anything, because you owe me nothing, But so you will never again believe the thing I am afraid the world lets you believe, that nobody ever came for you. Somebody came for you every single day. He just could not find the door. I found it too late for my legs, but not, I hope, too late for my flour. So I am leaving you the mill, not because it is worth money. It is not. I am leaving it to you, because it is the only thing I know how to give that keeps on giving after the giver is gone. A mill does not grind for the miller. It grinds for whoever is hungry. You were hungry, child, in every way there is, and I could not reach you in time to fix it. So I am giving you the power to make sure the next hungry one never has to wait as long as you did. Be kinder than I was. Say the thing today. And when you are old and it is your turn to go, leave the wheel turning. I got to hold you once. On paper, 3 days old, I have held that paper so long, it has come apart in my hands, and it was worth every single day. Your grandfather, Emmett Rourke. Odessa sat for a long time after she finished. She did not cry the way she had expected to. What she felt was quieter than that, and went down deeper. A settling, like a house finally standing level after years on a bad foundation. Then she took the worn newborn photograph from the shelf, the one Amos had carried out of a dead man's pocket, and she set it in a small frame beside a picture of Nell that Faye had found in an old church directory, her mother at 16. Laughing at something outside the edge of the photo, mother and daughter, side by side on the shelf, in the room the grandfather built. It was the closest the three of them would ever come to being in one place. Odessa decided it would have to be enough, and then she decided that it actually was. She forgave her mother that spring, not all at once, and not with any words. She simply stopped being angry at a frightened girl who had loved her and drowned before she could get back, and started being grateful that the loving had been real. Nell had spent her whole short life saving up for a homecoming, in a way Odessa could not fully explain. She felt she had finally made it home for her. Amos did not die that winter, the way the doctor kept predicting he would. He got stronger instead, or at least he stopped getting weaker, which everyone agreed was the same thing at his age. Odessa was half sure it was pure contrariness, and half sure it was because a man with a reason to get up in the morning is harder to kill than a man without one. She had made herself his reason without meaning to. Most days his nephew drove him up the hill, and he sat in his chair by the headgate with a blanket over his knees, and he watched the wheel turn, and he told anyone who would listen that he had taught the miller everything she knew. "You saved my last years, girl," he told her once, gruff, not looking at her. "I want that on the record. Old man was ready to lay down and quit. Then you came walking up my creek with Nell's hands and Emmett's stubbornness, and I had to stick around to see how it turned out. You gave me a whole family," Odessa said. "I'd say we're even." Amos snorted. "We're not even, but we're kin. That's better." Garrett Vane became, of all the unlikely things, a friend. He never made a show of it. But his supply trucks started finding reasons to come out the mill road, dropping off lumber he said was scrap he could not sell, which Odessa knew for a lie because it was good straight pine. He talked the county board out of the back tax penalty for the following year, and once, when he thought no one was watching, Odessa saw him stop his truck by the mill and just look at it for a while with his cap in his hand, at the wheel his family had eaten because of. Turning again in the light, the boy came in early summer. Faye brought him out, a 17-year-old the county was about to age out of a group home, 2 towns over with nothing but a garbage bag and a bus ticket, the same way the world had once turned Odessa loose. He stood in the mill yard, with his shoulders up around his ears and his eyes down, and Odessa knew that posture from the inside. She had worn it her whole life. Keep the bag small. Keep the eyes down. Never let them see you have nothing. You any good with your hands? She asked him. He shrugged, which meant he did not know, which meant nobody had ever given him the chance to find out. There's a room upstairs that's yours if you want it, Odessa said. It's got a bed and a lamp and a door that locks. Rents that you help me run this place, and you don't quit the first time something goes wrong, because something always goes wrong. She held out a mill bill, worn smooth by her own grandfather's hand and then by hers. I had somebody teach me. Now it's my turn. You in? The boy looked at the tool. He looked at the room where a lamp was already lit in the window. Something in his face that had been braced for the catch, for the trick, for the thing that would take it all away again, slowly gave up looking for it. "Yeah," he said, so quiet she almost missed it. "Okay, yeah." She showed him up to the room. It was the one Emmett had made ready for her, the fresh bed and the lamp and the little shelf, and she had never once been able to bring herself to sleep in it, because it had been made for a homecoming that was hers. She had taken her grandfather's old room for herself months back. Now she understood she had been keeping this one for a reason she could not have named. "It was made up for me before I ever got here," she told the boy, "by somebody who never got to meet me." He set out a lamp and a hairbrush and made the bed for a stranger he only hoped was coming. "I think he'd be glad it's yours." The boy sat down on the edge of the made bed, careful, braced for someone to walk in and tell him there had been a mistake and he had to leave. Nobody walked in. Nobody was ever going to. That was the whole point of the room, and it always had been. Odessa opened the ledger that night and turned to the first blank page after 50 years of her grandfather's names. At the top, in her own hand, she wrote the boy's name and a date, and beside it, 2 words she had inherited along with everything else: no charge. Amos was right about what her grandfather had left her. It was not a building, and it was not money, and it was not even the trade. Though the trade was part of it, it was a way of standing in the world. More than that, it was the discovery, at 19, that a person the whole system had written down as coming from nothing had in fact come from a line of people whose entire genius was making sure the person next to them never went without. The mill became the heart of the valley again, the way it had been before Odessa was born. On Saturdays, people came whether they had grain to grind or not. Children fished the race. Somebody built a bench under the great wheel, and nobody ever asked who. Bay started bringing extra bread on Saturdays, and it never once came home with her. Odessa set the ledger out where anyone could open it, all 50 years of no charge in her grandfather's careful pencil, and she watched people find their own names in it, or their mothers, or their fathers, and go quiet, and finally understand what the stubborn old man had been doing all those years with a book and a wheel and a sack of flour left on a porch before light. She kept the chair by the head gate for Amos, and when he was not in it, no one else sat there. It was understood. A whole valley had decided, without ever holding a meeting about it, that a girl who came in off the evening bus with nothing at all was one of theirs now, and had been the whole time, back before she or anyone else had known it. On a morning in high summer, Odessa was down at the mill before the sun cleared the ridge, raising the gate for the day's first grind. The water came cold off the race and struck the buckets, and the great wheel took up its turning, slow and sure, throwing light and spray into the early gold air. Inside, the stones woke and began their low rumble, and the first flower of the day drifted up through the sunbeams, fine and warm and white. A woman came up the road on foot as the flower was falling. Odessa did not know her, but she knew the walk, the small bag, the careful eyes of somebody counting what little she had. The woman asked, quiet and ashamed, whether there was any work, or failing that, whether the flour was dear. Odessa filled a sack with the morning's first grinding, still warm from the stones, and pressed it into the stranger's arms before she could finish the question. "On the house," she said. "There's coffee up at the shop if you want it. And if you're looking for work, come back tomorrow. I could use another pair of hands." The boy was watching from the mill door, and Odessa caught his eye and tipped her head toward the woman going up the road. "That right there is the job," she told him. "Everything else we do, the grinding and the fixing and the books, all of it is just how we keep the lights on so we can do that one thing when somebody needs it." She could see him turning it over, the beginning of understanding what sort of place he had walked into, and what sort of person a mill could make of him if he let it. She watched the woman go back up the road holding the warm sack against her chest, the way you hold something you did not expect to be given. Then Odessa went inside, and she opened the ledger, and she wrote one more name, and beside it, no charge. Behind her, the wheel that had stood silent and dead the first day she saw it turned steady in the summer light, grinding for whoever was hungry, the way it always had, the way it would go on doing long after she was the old one in the chair by the gate. She had come north with $31 in a duffel bag, looking for proof she came from somewhere. She had found the somewhere, and the someone, and in the end, she had become them. The creek ran on, the stones turned, and the girl who once had nobody stood in the door of a mill that carried her name and fed anyone who came to it, and she was, at long last, exactly where she belonged.